And it's a kind of Jurassic beautiful. It's like, you might get eaten up by mosquitoes, you might get killed by, any number of critters and get red bugs, but it's beautiful. And this setting is where our martyrs live out their ministry to the Wale people. And it's also, there's a mound in Savannah, Georgia, which is made of shells. And the anthropologists suggest that it may be one of the oldest places for human habitation in the country, which is weird because we always think that they came across the Bering Strait and went down, but then there's this anomaly, this shell mound in Savannah. So my point in saying all this is this has a long prehistory, which we cannot be really sure about, but it's a beautiful part of the world. But it's also a part of the world that's always changing. It's where the ocean meets the land, and the land, it's almost more water than it is land in many ways. It's a place of islands and estuaries, and so it's a place that's constantly changing. And so the landscape that is there today would probably not have been the landscape that was there in 1597. So we have to kind of keep that in mind when we're sort of imagining their world. It's a world that's in fluidity. It's a world that's changing often. The Georgia coast is not very big, but it holds, I think, I want to say a third. I think I read that it holds a third of the marshland that is on the eastern side of North America. So it's just this really rich area, and a beautiful area. But it's, at the time, of course, it was part of La Florida. And so we have funny names that we still hang on to today. Spanish moss, Spanish bayonets. These are our names for plants that remind us that this was not always an English colony, right? It was a Spanish colony or a part of the world. I want to give us a little bit of historical, this is to give you a sense of the Ioans, his coming to what is today and establishing one of the oldest English colonies. We often hear about Roanoke, but this is actually older than Roanoke and older than St. Augustine. It just didn't last, right? But this gives us a little bit of historical context, and I'm going to leave this slide up for a minute and just let you look at it because you'll find things that are interesting to you. And what I think is important to point out is that this was a period of extraordinary vigor in Spain. I mean, the Spanish Renaissance was in its full steam. You had poets, you had philosophers, you had theologians, you had universities, you had musicians, composers, and at the same time you had conquistadors and warriors and explorers and people circumnavigating the world. I mean, it was just a remarkable zenith, really, in Spanish history. And in the midst of all of that, Pedro de Corpa and companions are martyred. And you'll see in the blue there that sort of gives you a sense of these are the English things, right? But you see the yellow are kind of the Georgia or La Florida things. And how it puts it into a historical context that I think is important. So their world was La Florida, and here shows a map of what would become Georgia, but it says Florida. And this is a map in the year 1597. And the capital of La Florida was St. Augustine. And they had offered a mass there on the 8th of September of 1565. And you can go down there, in the corner there's the rustic altar. It's a cement altar, and it's meant to look like a wooden log altar. And you can take pilgrimages down there, and the oldest shrine to Our Lady is there. So St. Augustine is a wonderful place to visit. We used to visit with our teens at my last parish. I'd love to do that again sometime, maybe with Mary our Queen. But that was the capital of this world. But this world was not just of one kind of Indian, right? There were the Appalachian, to the west, there were the Timucuan, who were more or less directly there, but above that there were the Wale, and then there were others. And so the Wale were sort of in this area, sort of really just kind of in the coastal parts of Georgia, right? Below Savannah, above Darien. Here's another map of the Wale lands. Okay, so we'll get to introduce them we'll start at the far left, that's Pedro de Corpa, and he's holding a cross. It's hard to see in the slide. And then next to him is Blas, who's tied up. And in the middle here is Miguel, and we're going to talk about each of these. And then to the next in line is Antonio, and then the tall fellow is Francisco. He's always the tallest. They called him the giant. So a little bit about the Wale people. They practiced in pre-Christian days polygamy, and polygamy was a way. The power was in the hands of the men, but the money, was kind of in the hands of the women. Sort of, if you can sort of make it like the men were. It was a matrilineal culture, and so if you were a chief, you wanted multiple wives, so you could have lots of power and lots of, and you could be sort of a king, really. But what happens in that culture is if you're not wealthy and you're a man, you have no bride, right? So when the Spanish came in and they began to evangelize, they had convinced the people of the veracity of the gospel, and they had them all, understandably, they said, okay, you understand the gospel, you understand the church, if you're going to get baptized, you know that you can only have one wife. And so they had made that decision. But then there was this young fellow by the name of Juanillo, and he wanted to go back. And he was baptized, but he wanted to go back and to have multiple wives. So he was kind of apostatizing, really, in the faith. And it was left to Pedro de Corpa to say no to the chief. So Juanillo was sort of like a King Henry VIII kind of figure, right? And Pedro de Corpa is kind of a St. John Fisher kind of figure. And Pedro de Corpa was a young man, he was not 40, and he was in the capital of the Wale people. Because he had served the Wale for the longest. And so he was in charge of the mission that was where the head chief was. So he was in the middle of this struggle, right? When Juanillo wanted to achieve, receive, the head chiefdom, it was Pedro who said, well, okay, but that's not Catholic. So you can't receive the sacraments, you can't be Catholic, and then the people didn't want Juanillo to be the chief, and so it caused this political struggle. And we see that today, right, with politicians today who want to call themselves Catholic sometimes, but don't really want to live by them. And sometimes a cleric has to say no. And Pedro de Corpa was that guy. And he was the most experienced of them. And the name of the mission was Mission de la Natividad de Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, which is the mission of the Nativity of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And it was in the town of Stigmata. We'll talk a little bit about Stigmata, and it's near Darien, Georgia. What's interesting about that is in Darien, Georgia, there's a Catholic church, which is the Nativity of Our Lady, which I think is wonderful, that the modern church sort of mirrors the name of the old original mission that was nearby. Incidentally, that is going to be a kind of shrine center for the Georgia Martyrs. The symbol of Pedro de Corpa is the crucifix, because he died on the feast of the exaltation of the cross. And it was a Sunday morning, and the exaltation of the cross is one of those feasts that eclipse a Sunday. So, even though it was a Sunday, it was also the exaltation of the cross, and he was preparing for Mass. He was in his convento, and he was praying, and Juanillo and these sort of rebellious fellows burst in and killed him with a macana, which is a stone hatchet or axe, and then they cut off his head, and they put his head on a spike, and he was the first to die. And the city of Tolomato, one of the things you need to understand about Native American cities in this part of the world is they moved. So, like, the last place Tolomato was outside of St. Augustine, Florida. So Tolomato, what they would do is they would establish a city, and then they would put down a palisade, and then they would, begin to farm, begin to cut down wood, begin to farm, begin to cut down wood. And when the wood got so far away that it was hard to carry it in to Byrd, they said, okay, we've depleted the soil, it's time to move on to a new site. So one of the challenges we have archaeologically is finding the missions, because their whole culture was so movable, right? And yet, in Tolomato, wherever Tolomato was, and we don't know exactly where it was, they burned down the bohio, which is the chief's, sort of the Senate chamber, if you will, right? And also the mission and the convent. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, the mission and the convent, because they're two different things. So this is Little Darien, and this church is so small. I don't know. It might fit up. It's so little. It's dinky, but it is closest to where it all began, and it's a beautiful part of Georgia. So this is a mission in Florida. It's reconstruction in Tallahassee, Mission San Luis Rey, and you see here the bohio is this sort of thing in the top left-hand corner, which looks kind of like a big teepee or a pyramid made of rattan and wood. And then the mission church would have been white clapboard, probably wattled and daubed and clapboard or wood, and would have had a thatched roof. And next door to it would have been the convent where the monks or the friars slept, and where the children were taught, and the catechesis occurred. And behind that would be the kitchen or cucina. All right, so we move on. So, they left, the raiding party left Tolomato, and they went next to the nearby city of Tupique. And Tupique it's not as established, but the priest there is named Blas, and he had not been there the longest, but he was the most senior of the Franciscans, so it was kind of it was a superior. Sometimes the abbot is not in charge of the college, and sometimes it just depends on how they divide things. But he was a very holy man. He had been known for holiness in Spain, and he had left Spain, a very comfortable Spain, where he was very renowned, and he came to the missions. And he was deeply concerned about the souls of his people, the Wale. And one of the things that Juanillo did was he came in to Tupique and he said, we're going to kill him. And Blas said, well, let me say a last Mass. Amazing, huh? And so Blas offered a last Mass in the little mission church, and he even preached to the people who were going to kill him, and talked to them about mercy and forgiveness and how it's important not to commit terrible sins. And he gave away what few possessions he had. Now, they would have had some things there that the King of Spain would have given them, like vestments. It would have been a lovely little place. And they tied him up, and they just went for 2 days torturing him, but also just burning and desecrating the chapel. So it It was, so when we see laws, we'll always see them tied and rope. That's how we recognize it. So, Manilio and his raiding party leave Topekwi, but they burn the whole town down. So no longer are they just burning the mission, down in the capital, because, in Stigmata they burned the Bohio because they had not chosen him as chief, and they burned the mission church. But here they burned the whole town, in part because the town had not done what Manilio had asked them to do. So Manilio was presuming to be the Miko, or the head chief, and he had ordered the caciques in all of these villages, the chiefs, the governors, to kill all of the missionaries. But then when he got to Topekwi, he found them, they weren't killed. And these people actually came to mass, so he was mad, so he burned the whole town of Topekwi. This happened, by the way, on September 17th, the feast of the Stigmata of St. Francis. So, imagine you're praying, laws and on the feast of the exaltation of the cross, and then you get martyred, or on the feast of the Stigmata of St. Francis, and you get martyred. It's like in their prayer, they were looking at what was literally going to happen to them minutes later. So from Topekwi, after this, Manilio and his raiding party go to St. Catalina, the Wale. And this is the one mission where we actually know where it is, or where it was. And we have, archaeologists have actually dug it up. Anthropologists have studied it. It's marked. But it's on an island, St. Catherine's Island, where, none of you can go. You have to be invited. There's no bridge. So it's safe from us, in a way. The ocean might take it. But it's also inaccessible. But you can get invited to go there on occasion. But that wasn't the largest city of the Wale. So the Stigmata had been the capital city, like Washington, if you will. But Santa Catalina, the Wale, was like the largest city. Like, we can imagine New York or Chicago. It doesn't necessarily, the largest isn't necessarily the capital. And this was the oldest of all of the missions, and it was the most successful. And there were two friars who were here. There was one by the name of Antonio, and he is always shown praying a rosary, in part because we need to recognize who he was, but also because they knew they were going to die. They were told that they were going to die, and so they began to pray. And one of the things that you find in the archaeological digs in Santa Catalina, the Wale, the mission there, were beads and rosary beads. And so Antonio was shown with a rosary. He was a lay brother, he had a tonsure, and they allowed him to preach. He was the linguist, and he was the one who best understood the language of the Wale. By the way, the Wale, the oldest book in North America, which is lost, was a primer and a catechesis in the language of the Wale, right? This just gives you sort of a sense of that rich history. So he was the one who kind of knew the language, and so they had a new head of the mission, who was Miguel de Amon. He was a young fellow, he was a nobleman, and a good man, but he was still learning the language. So Antonio was there as his associate to help him get to know the people. And we always can recognize Miguel because he's the fellow, he's usually clean shaven, and he's holding that palmetto palm. Again, that symbol of victory. Miguel was clearly competent because they had given him the largest mission. He had great dreams of digging more wells and building more churches. And it's hard for us to imagine their world that St. Augustine, Florida was burned by Sir Francis Drake, the pirate. And for a while, the Spaniards actually considered moving their capital to because it was getting hit by so many pirates to Santa Catalina. So it was a big place, and these were competent men. And so here we see maybe what the, because we're told that the missions were wattle and daub, which is you sort of put the rattan together and then you put kind of a mud clay over it or stucco, and then you whitewash it. So it may be how their churches looked. But you need to understand that the cacique in Santa Catalina actually he met Juanillo out of town on the outskirts of the town and begged them not to kill the priest. And he said, I'll give you everything I have. Please don't go kill our priest. But Juanillo would not stand for it. He was going to kill these two men. And so, no doubt they had said Mass, and at least Antonio could go to confession. Poor Miguel could not. But they were ultimately killed. And they were the whole village kind of departed. So it's like, the villagers were afraid because they had burned the whole city of Topeka down, right? So they just ran to the woods. So it was really like this war party and these two friars. And when they killed the friars, they left them just sort of in the town and where they fell. And they would later be buried by the wale who came out of the woods. So this is sort of another image of Antonio. He's praying his rosary. There's actually rosary beads that you can order online that have the faces of the Georgia Martyrs. So this is one of the pater beads. Antonio there. And this is Miguel. Again, always with his palmetto palm. Again, the rebels burned the church in the convent, and the two mutilated bodies were just left where they fell. And thereafter, the wale emerged from the woods and buried them beneath the mission cross that Father Miguel had actually erected, not too many, not much earlier, just not that long ago. Here we see speculation as to what the wale houses were probably like. They were told they were round, and that they were wattle and daub, and that they were whitewashed. Just sort of a way to imagine their world. The last to die is Francisco de Verascola. In many ways, he's kind of a favorite, but really I would not care about all of them. But he was young. He was 33. He was the youngest fellow. And he's always shown with a straw hat, sometimes with an oar and a straw hat. And he was very tall. Again, he was our giant. And he was very athletic and very muscular. There had been an expedition a few months before his martyrdom where they had gone in, the Francisco de Verascola had gone in with Juanillo actually as one of his guides and a party into the inlands of what is today Georgia to the Oconee Valley. And there they made first contact with some of the other Indian tribes. There's records of this. And but we're told that, all of the natives were very fascinated with this tall Franciscan, and they sometimes would challenge him to wrestle. And so, he must have made a very good first impression on the native people. But keep in mind that because Francisco had made that trip with Juanillo, he trusted him, right? I mean, they had been colleagues on this journey. So Francisco had been down to St. Augustine, Florida, and he'd been going down on his little canoe there, and had been bringing back supplies, and he really had no idea what was happening. This was before cell phones and internet. So, he disembarked, very likely even waved and greeted the people who were coming to meet him, but they ultimately grabbed him and killed him. surprised him. He was tall, he was athletic, so they had to surprise him. One of the relics of Francisco, they lose his body, but one of the relics of Francisco that went back to St. Augustine, Florida, was this hat. So again, you see the hat in a lot of the iconography. Here's another slide of Francisco. There's the little church where he was baptized, and they have a little festival there to honor him every year. And there's a newspaper called El Correo, and it's in Bilbao, and there's an article on October the 10th, 2019, and they speculated there, and this is the Spanish speculating, but they speculated there that Francisco de Verascola may well have been the first European to play the game that eventually became soccer. And so it's kind of, you see him playing soccer with the youth up here on the beach. This is just to give you this is a cypress boat. Cypress lasts forever. That's why you build with cypress if you live in Louisiana or any place where you have it. And now and then archaeologists will find these cypress canoes, then centuries later. And this is one of them. So it gives you a sense of the kind of dugout canoe that the Wale would have used, but also that Francisco de Verascola was coming home in. So this is how our rebellion ends. There's a little bit more of a story which we'll get back to, but these rebels get so excited, they start pulling people together, they're like, let's go to the Temucuans, San Pedro, and kill their Franciscans. Well, different tribe, right? And the fellow who's the chief in San Pedro mission of the Temucuans is named Juan Pedro. He has no intention whatsoever, Don Juan has no intention whatsoever of obeying this upstart, rebel bunch of hooligans. And so they approach this mission by night, and they see a Spanish ship there, and some of them wisely, some of them wisely back off and go away because they figure the Spanish, keep in mind, lived in these missions too. And very often intermarried with these people, they lived among them, but that ship made them fearful that there would have been a garrison there. And we should talk about that a little bit. Because very often you hear how, the Spanish came in with all their conquistadors and forced people into religion. These men did not have any guards. There were no soldiers, right? They were Franciscans, barefoot Franciscans, living in a Wale village with no protection. But when the Wale rebels saw that ship, some of them backed up. Some of them unwisely actually attacked in the morning and were defeated. But that marks kind of the end of the rebellion of Juanillo. And Juanillo actually retreats to the hinterlands of Georgia, and he's chased down and killed by his own people. So it's a tragic story. Now, I told you there was a little bit of another story. This is Francisco de Avila. I think to me is one of the more interesting figures because I love Teresa of Avila and Victoria and what was going on in Avila at the time. This guy probably knew these people. Juan de la Cruz, he probably knew these people. He was, keep in mind, he was he had grown, Avila's not a big place, right? But he was another one of the Franciscans who was captured, but he was a confessor, he was not martyred. They captured him, they tortured him, they tempted him, they enslaved him. And about 10 months later, he was traded and freed. And he went to St. Augustine, Florida, and there was the governor there demanded, because nobody had known what would happen. They just found all these burned missions, what had happened. And Francisco de Avila actually knew what had happened because he had lived and he had heard the Indians talk while they talked, and he could piece together the story for us. But he refused to tell the governor in St. Augustine because he understood that the governor in St. Augustine was very likely a vindictive man that was going to go up and kill the Wale. And so he was sent on a ship to Havana, which was where the archbishop would have been, and under holy obedience, he was asked to write down the story. And that's why we know what happened to the Georgia Martyrs. And so we owe some gratitude to Francisco de Avila. Now, as I've said before, after all that had happened and transpired, the chiefs of the Wale went back to St. Augustine and asked the governor, the different governor, please send us more Franciscans, and more Franciscans came. So it's not a question of, like, all of the Wale hated the Catholics. The Wale were Catholic, right? They had a rebellious group among them. But they wanted the Franciscan friars back, and the Franciscan friars wanted to go back, and they lived for generations as Catholics. This is a drawing for a painting that is being planned for St. Michael's in Gainesville. And it's unique because it shows not only the Georgia Martyrs, but it also shows representatives of the Wale people. And you can see in this, even the sketch, that they were already being attired and clothed as Europeans. They'd already sort of, they were integrating. They were integrated. That'll be an epic painting. I think it's like 10 feet wide. It's going to be massive. So again, speculating. This is what one of the missions might have looked like. Wobbling doll, plain wood, whitewashed with thatch roof. Here's another example of what it might have looked like. And this little image in the corner here, that's actually the site of Santa Catalina. And you'll see palmetto trees or palm trees that are planted. Those are where the posts were. So that's the one mission that we know where it was. And that has been fully, the archaeologists have done their work there, fully excavated. And something like 300 I'll just say many, Wale were buried there. And they were reburied there. And now the ocean might take it, but it is a sweet place. And when the calls for the beatification for the Georgia Martyrs went to Rome, I was invited by then Bishop Hartmeyer of Savannah and the Diocese of Savannah to go to a mass that was offered there, and I preached there on Santa Catalina. Which is a great place. If you can somehow find an invitation to go to St. Catherine's, that's a place that's almost magical. So here again, this is a new painting that's being worked on currently for Holy Spirit Catholic Church. I love the personalities of the faces. These artists are all over, and this was the first of the retablos or paintings that was done. It was done for Our Lady of the Mountains. It's the one that the Vatican is sort of endorsing and using. It's very small, it's about this big. And this is a new painting for St. Luke's in Delano. This was the Mass that I went to. And see, I took the little retablo there in front of the altar. I took it with me, bouncing over the water figure. As I mentioned before, Stigmata and these cities moved, and the last place that Stigmata was in St. Augustine, Florida. And the oldest cemetery in the United States of America is Stigmata Cemetery. It's on the grounds of where the mission was. And there was a priest there, and they lived there. And there was a 4-story belfry on this church. I mean, it was a wonderful church. These are our fellow Catholics, the Wally. They're not the people who slew the Franciscans. They're the people with us who worship the same Lord and the same God. But there's something called the Black Legend, and I would just encourage you to read up on this. And we as English speakers receive our history through the lens of what's called the Black Legend. And Henry VIII had divorced Catherine of Aragon. And that started an imperial war between the little upstart, dinky island of then England and the massive Spanish empire, really. But England and Spain just go at it. And in all of that propaganda, a lot of it's Protestant propaganda, it was all about how wicked and evil the Spaniards were. So I think sometimes as students of history, we owe it to ourselves as Catholics to be suspect of that when it starts to sound like prejudice, and to actually do more research into that. I linked a really good lecture on our Facebook page, I think last week, on the Black Legend, if you'd like to learn more about that. Well, one of the things that was happening, the differences, I will say, is that the English saw the indigenous people as someone to be gotten rid of, right? There was not a strong effort to evangelize these people. There was no effort to intermarry with them, right? So they would come in and they would really try to enslave the indigenous people, to take the lands, to build plantations. That was an English kind of colony. Whereas the Spanish, because of the Pope, because of the Catholic teachings, because of the School of Salamanca, because of all this human rights, they said, no, we can't enslave these people. We have to evangelize them. And the king encouraged people to marry into these families. And so it's a very different way of looking at the New World, the English way and the Spanish way. And the English would arm their allies because they wanted their allies to fight and to suppress the Catholic Indians, if you will. Whereas the Catholics were trying to keep the indigenous people out of these imperial wars, right? So it was kind of a best intentions led to a tragedy. But there was an effort to genocide towards the Wale, and they ultimately disappeared. That is not to say that there are people today alive who probably are descendants of Wale, maybe in Cuba, maybe some in America too, but for the most part the tribe disappeared. So again, symbols, you'll see oftentimes the sand dollar with its 5 points to represent the 5 Georgia Martyrs, and the extinct parakeet that mates for life, and Georgia peaches, and also our palmetto palm. There are some references that if you want to learn more, and I can share that with you. There's an epic poem called La Florida, but there's also reports of what Father Francisco de Avila wrote down. I have a funny little picture here. There's a relic, one of the pieces of archaeological find that was dug up in St. Catherine's there, of Our Lady. But this funny little picture in the middle is one of my favorite rides as a kid at Six Flags. which was the riverboat ride, which we took back into coastal Georgia. I think I was always kind of intrigued by this history. One of the latest pieces of artwork, of course, is the one that we welcome today by Daniel Mitsui. Anyway, those are 5 Georgia Martyrs. The cause is ongoing. You can pray for that cause and get to know these men and help to spread their stories so that people know more about them. I think we have time for some questions if anybody has any questions. Yes?
Can you give us a little history of the cause? It seems like there's...
Well, I can tell you that when I was in seminary, before the turn of the century, I had gone to Savannah and I talked to this lovely lady in the archives. She was an English lady, and there was some. I think the person who could tell us more about it would be Paul Thigpen. He's here, but the postulator at the time, or the guy behind it, besides Paul, was a fellow at Franciscan University. And they were kind of pushing the cause, but now it's actually before the Vatican. So there's a lot of work that goes into all that. And then, it could stall there for centuries. We just don't know, that's why, I'm sort of get excited about it, but I may never see it be edified. But I don't think that's necessarily going to mean that I'm wasting my time. So, all right. Yes?
What was the time frame between when they were killed to where they were invited back?
Well, it's about a week. The first death and the last death was about a week.
Oh, that's all.
Yeah.
Although I think she's asking between that and when they were invited back.
When
But
the
when-
Oh, you know what? I just don't. I don't remember. It wasn't long. Would you do it, Paul?
I'm thinking less than a year, I could be wrong.
Right.
It's a matter of months, I think.
Did I miss anything, Paul? Would you like to add something to this story?
There's so much we can say.
Yeah, there's some
Thank you,
questions.
the slides are wonderful.
Well, yes.
So I've been to Jekyll Island, which is on the coast of Georgia.
Right.
And some of the historic buildings there include buildings that had oyster shells as part of the sides of the building.
Tabby.
Yes.
Yeah.
So is it possible that some of the sides would have had that?
What I understand is that tabby does not last 400 years. So there were some buildings that were made of tabby that they did find that they thought that they had identified as maybe missions. Later, archaeologists and historians said, no, that's actually a sugar mill from 150 years later. So again, I think there's only one place that they know of. Now, in Darien, there is at Fort King George, I think it's called, they tell you there that there was a Wali village and mission there, and there was, but it wasn't the one, because there again, the towns moved, it was one of them that came, it was one of the missions where they have come back. So as far as like the original place, somewhere near Darien, Topeka, somewhere near Eulonia, is that how you say it? The little town in Georgia. But again, the land there is so amorphous, it's constantly moving, so who knows? Any other questions? All right, get to know the martyrs, you're awesome. Thank you all.
Thank you.